My name is Robert Long. I am the Programs and Exhibition Manager here at the Fort Worth Community Arts Center, and I'd like to welcome y'all to the Visit Fort Worth Gallery and speaking with Matthew Bourbon about his practice and current exhibition Hive. So thank you and welcome. Matthew Bourbon is a painter, art critic, and professor of art at the College of Visual Art and Design at UNT. Matthew earned separate graduate degrees in studio art and art history from the University of California at Davis, and a Master's of Fine Arts degree from the School of Visual Art in New York. Matthew has exhibited nationally and internationally, including Wider West at the Oil Tank Culture Park in Seoul, South Korea, Ceste de la Peinture at the Bankley Studio and Gallery in Manchester, England, and Waiting for Now at the Old Jail Art Center in Texas. So let's welcome Matthew and thank you for coming. So I wanted to start off because I didn't know a lot of your work previously with your sort of early work. Yep. And as I was getting to know your work, it's still dealing with abstraction, but dealing with its vignettes and sort of like scenes, where the figure and some of the other components in the scene have been abstracted with a similar style with the hashes and the grids. Could you talk about where your work was and why the abstraction?
Yeah. So, I kind of wish I had an image to show you or something so you could get a picture of what it was, but you described it pretty well. They're essentially vignettes of usually figures within a room, crafted from multiple sources, but mostly at that point it was kind of late grad school from film. And so this was pre-digital time period, so I would be taking photographs off of my television of film noir or like screwball comedies from the 30s and 40s, so like Philadelphia Story or Bring Up Baby, that kind of thing. And I was sort of interested in capturing little moments within the films as a place to jump off in the painting, not really to tell the same story, but as a kind of place to leap off as I started the painting. But when I was making those images or photographing them from the TV, I would go get them processed really cheaply in New York, and they would always screw it up, basically. So it would come back and there would be lines running through it, or like weird halos, or because the images were black and white, the films were black and white, and it was being photographed off a television, there would be kind of a strange coloration.
And some of that like colored pixel, like electric.
Kind of broken up pieces, but also just the haze of the TV changed the black and white and sort of charged it in a weird way. So I was sort of interested in multiple things that were happening from the kind of junky photographic sources.
Yeah.
And the abstraction became a character essentially in the sort of vignette that I was framing. So I got really kind of intrigued by how abstraction or these sort of disruptions could maybe say something about the underlying psychology that I was interested in, or something like that. So I did that for a long time, and that sort of abstract quality kept creeping in the painting over the years and got more pronounced. And I started to cobble together more sources, so it was less directed from a film source necessarily. It would be kind of a collage-like idea, if not literally collaged, but sort of piecing together.
The works where there would be still the figurative sort of element, and for me it almost seemed like voyeuristic, like the ones where it's just like the guy in the waiting room and like, but then you would have these components that were like fully abstract, little component like tacked and components like a grouping as a triptych or a diptych. And where was that in that kind of process?
Well, I think I basically wanted to do everything at once. That's the bottom line. I wanted to be everything at once. So I wanted to be this figurative, actually I kind of didn't want to be the figurative painter, but I knew I kind of was the figurative painter and that there was some interest there that I had to kind of pursue. But I wanted to sort of have my hand in all these other things at the same time, whether it was abstraction or whether it was sort of like I would always make paintings within paintings, so there'd be things behind.
Yeah.
You know, and so I would be thinking about, oh, I'm going to be a third-rate, graphic designer in the back, of my painting, and that was a lot of fun. So I guess it was like an interest in all of those voices happening simultaneously, and what that meant for the narrative, like how it confused the narrative, or like I was never interested in the one story. Like even early on with the films, I really wasn't interested in the film story. I was interested in like the pregnant moment that was set up that could be lots of different.
And it never feels like that. I don't think you were directing titles directly from the films.
No,
I didn't think so.
They always sort of come at an angle.
Yeah, because I wouldn't have like known that. I felt like they could have been like you were in the waiting room with that other person and just like sort of like rough sketched it out, or and no, they're all pulled from this.
They're all pieced together out of these little fragments that become this thing,
this whole.
Yeah,
nice. And then from there, it was about what, like 2016, 17. You started moving more toward
maybe, something like that.
Breaking
around
it down.
there.
So what made that shift to this sort of more abstract thing than the actual figurative in the narrative in the work?
Well, I wound up getting this fellowship through UNT that was basically geared towards musicians, creative writers, or artists, visual artists. And you were able to get a release, so you got time off, you made a sort of a body of work of whatever that was, whatever your discipline was, and then it had to be exhibited at, like in some context at UNT. So at that time they had a gallery that was on the square in downtown Denton. UNT held that gallery, and it was primarily for musicians and visual artists. And so I knew it was going to land there, whatever I did was going to land there. And to be honest, I thought, well, like not everybody's going to come up and see it because it's a little hard to get up there or whatever. So I treated it just like a laboratory. Like the whole process was sort of exploratory, things that I wanted to do in the painting, but just held off for whatever reasons because I had the next show or whatever. I kind of allowed myself to play, and so that show wound up being a lot of language, works based out of language. Works that had sort of paintings combined with wooden constructions that sort of abutted next to each other, or I would stretch patterned fabric, and have that next to the paintings. I had sort of things that were on stacks. It was just like doing everything essentially. And as I was completing that body of work leading up to that show, I kind of knew I was sort of turning a page on the figuration. And I had these ideas of kind of doing something like this, but I couldn't really make the paintings because I was finishing the show for that. So I'm like, oh, this is not good. And so, because I had to get that stuff out of my head somehow, just to see what was there. So I started making drawings. And so all this basically started from a drawing practice, which I had never really done before.
Right.
Like I never made preparatory drawings for the earlier work, or just didn't really engage in drawing in that way. It was always directly in the painting. But I started to make these drawings kind of on the side.
And so that was one thing that I've really enjoyed about your social media and your Instagram output are these they're sort of like photo dumps, but they're sketchbooks, and you call them speed drawings. So how much does that play as are those drawings, are they studies, or are they just keeping your hand and brain working, or do they literally translate at some point to what we see in them?
Well, they're never a literal translation, so I can still do not use them as I've made this drawing and now I'm just going to translate it and make the painting look like the drawing. I'm just not interested in that anyway. But I did start making them as speed drawings recently, which is what I called them. And primarily because I do them during class when I'm teaching. So I go talk to, it's usually on work days when they're working. So I go talk to the students, and I'm having our conversation, and they get bored with me, and they want to go away. I want to make my work. And so I go and I just make a drawing as fast as I possibly can. And then I go to the next person.
Check on them.
So I'm kind of going back and forth. And so they're a little different than the first drawings that started this work, but they're a way for me to kind of not edit, not self-censor in any way, not refine, and not really care too much whether they're good or bad. just to kind of unleash like whatever's going to come as quickly as I can. And then, I do think about, like, I may find things in those that, like little techniques or something, a way of framing something or whatever, that will find its way back into this, but never directly.
Okay, nice. So one thing in this sort of transition, and it was beginning at the same time, was is it Seizen? Is it Seizen meditation?
Zazen.
Zazen,
yeah.
Zazen meditation. And that was occurring with Robert Jessup. Is that correct?
Yes, sort of.
Sort of?
Yeah. I had a meditation practice for a long, long time.
Okay.
Probably mid-90s is when I started, maybe a little bit before that, and just on my own. I sort of was introduced to it in San Francisco, and then continued that practice on my own. And then Robert Jessup, who's former UNT professor, now retired, he started to practice maybe in the 2000s sometime, and started to talk to me about it. And so basically we would have these chat sessions about Zen and sitting practice and all this stuff, and maybe how it related to what we were doing in our studio. And at some point we decided, well, we should try to sit together. Let's do this. And so we started to sit together a little bit, just to see what that would do, because we would always just sat on our own, basically. Yeah. And there is a kind of difference that happens when you're sitting with somebody. And so then I kind of codified it and created this Iron Bell Zen, and people started to come, and so now it's been this thing for a while where we sat in person, but since COVID, we now actually sit on Zoom because I have people far and wide, who come.
That's cool. So are you currently just doing it through the Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Are you going to bring it back to a live thing, you think?
Well, it's a little hard because I've got people in Washington State and Colorado, and I don't want to I guess we could do Zoom and in person, but I'm not sure yet. Yeah, I'm not sure.
So in this sort of shift from the figurative, for me it felt in this line of the voyeuristic and the outward looking to a shift, especially with some of the titles and the title head that's in this, to a more inward. Is it directly related to that meditation practice?
Partially, I would say, yeah. I think like the earlier work that was more narrative based and figurative and all that stuff we talked about, to me that's a kind of discursive, I'm talking to you kind of work. And I think I've grown slightly disenchanted with work that is forward facing that way. Maybe as I get older I'm a little more skeptical of that voice or something within work. I mean, that doesn't mean work can't be great that does that, and I certainly have examples of other artists that I think are great at that. But for me, it felt like that's something that had to take a back seat. That even though my interest in sort of that forward-facing voice was still sort of obscured through questions about how paintings speak in terms of narrative and not being super direct, I wanted to sort of let some of that go and get to something kind of more fundamental and basic, and start from there.
I mean, for me, there is, especially like with a teenage feeling head, is that title cross right there? There is that sort of narrative when a person, and like when I come up and I'm like, man, I don't know if I would want to go back to that 16, 17-year-old and like really invade that space.
Who would?
Yeah, I mean, you are, maybe if you're ruminating on that subject as you're working on these, does it come from a direct, like, going back to that moment or that thing in your own head as you're working on it?
It happens in different ways. Sometimes I have a long list of titles that I just keep compounding more and more and more, and most of them are pretty bad, honestly. but sometimes I'll start something in a painting and it feels like it gets connected to a phrase or a title that I have going. And so that will maybe color how I'm, like some of the choices I'm making or sort of where I'm pointing the ship, go that way versus that way. Other times the title will come later, maybe towards the end, and then it's more of a kind of feeling of how do I match.
Right.
How does it, how do the words feel right to what this thing is, or how do they crack open maybe a different trajectory to thinking about it or something?
So it's not a distinct like direction as you're going. It's not like this idea and then I'm going to try to work this out in a visual manner versus a spoken manner.
Yeah, I mean, to me that would feel more like the earlier paintings, right? It would feel like, I'm directing you, here I am telling you what the painting's
Well, I mean more about directing yourself versus directing
It is
us.
it is a little bit about directing me, I guess, but even that's held pretty loosely.
Okay.
Like I'm always kind of trying to contradict myself.
Yeah.
Basically, within the painting technique-wise or something, or like, the differences amongst the moments in the painting, but also sort of how I'm thinking about them.
Yeah.
Because I think that the narration that happens around work, any work, but, more intimately my work, I can tell lots of different stories about it.
Yeah.
And so, like, what ones are the real ones? There's a little bit of an unreliable narrator quality to any time that we're talking about work, I think.
Yeah.
And so I think part of this body of work is acknowledging that, maybe, that it's not, that I'm not being as forthright and direct as I was, in my earlier life or something.
Well, I mean, for me, it sort of felt like you were being more direct with yourself versus the audience.
Yeah, maybe.
But, I mean, it could, and we trick ourselves all the time, so it's not like an unusual aspect. You had mentioned language a couple times, and you had mentioned Samuel Beckett
in
one of those shows used a quote of his. Is there any specificity to his work and his use of language that appeals to you, or is like
maybe a profound skepticism about like the value of language? I mean, I feel like there's a big paradox in people like Beckett or others that where you are understanding the limits of what a territory is, whether it's writing or whether it's making paintings or whatever the thing is. And so there's a kind of melancholy maybe around that, like what those limits are, but at the same time, a kind of dogged hopefulness that there's something to be found anyways.
Yeah.
In like banging your head against the wall again and again and again. And to me, that's kind of how art feels. Yeah. The making, at least. For me.
When I first sort of like caught that, it presented more to me in like the earlier works, and this idea of absurdism, and there was somewhat of that in the figurative with the abstraction of the grotesque and the loud, which I saw settling. So I was wondering, because that's when you were sort of moving this direction is when you employed that quote from Beckett. And so, do you feel that there is that absurdist often is like judged as this sort of loud and obnoxious, which I don't see really in any of your works, even though there was a sense of the grotesque in some of the form once they're starting to get abstracted. But do you have...
Yeah, I mean, I think absurdity can be that loud, sort of mildly obnoxious voice, but I think it can be also tied to that melancholy, that sort of undercurrent of seeing the layers of life, or like the problems of life, meeting the joys of life, and just sort of trying to wrestle with all of that as what it is, the reality of it. And to me, that I guess that also comes back to the Zen practice and the sitting practice, which is, the particular kind of sitting that I do comes out of Soto Zen, which has this idea of called shikintaza, which is essentially translates as just sitting. But like a lot of meditation practices, like count your breath, or you're gonna feel better, or like be mindful, and all that's great and fine. But This particular strain of sitting meditation is not that. It's just sitting. Yeah, it's like it's kind of a monkish, just do it over and over and over kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that also feels like it really relates to something absurd maybe, but also something real.
It seems difficult for me in any type of meditation I've ever like sat with, and it's usually group led. Getting out of that space without some other distraction would seem like it would take a lot of time and work for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the idea of what people have of meditation is you stop thinking. You're supposed to stop thinking, you know.
Yeah.
And that's really not what this practice is. It's kind of having a third awareness in your mind or something, like, you know, the observer.
Okay.
So, you know, if you are sitting and your mind is racing, which it will race, if you can step back from that and go, oh my God, my mind is racing. Like, well, who's saying that your mind is racing if your mind is racing?
Yeah.
Like, that's the observer